So tonight we are dealing with the topic of persecution, and Dr. Brunson's words that persecution is coming to the West, but we're not ready for it, is based on his own life story and his own experience. Now, there is a bit of a generational gap when it comes to this idea in the West right now. For Christians who are typically older, and I mean baby boomers and above, the idea that persecution would come to the West seems completely ridiculous. For people my parents' age, which is most of you, you grew up in a time in which being Christian was kind of normal. Whether you went to church or not, basically everybody believed this stuff. It was in the water. You may have had some people who were more fervent believers and some people who were less fervent believers. But for most of, and I'm talking most of Western civilization, this was out there. Now, what happened in specifically two areas of our country, the Pacific Northwest and the Northeast, up into especially New England, is two different factors began to play, which is now creeping throughout the entire country. In the Pacific Northwest, you largely had a region that had a religious settlement passed to it, but didn't have any major religious movement as part of its founding narrative. So in Washington and Oregon specifically, Idaho is a little squirrely because of its association with Mormonism. But in Washington and Oregon specifically, you have never had a major religious movement, a major religious revival movement of any sort, Christian or otherwise, that has taken place in these two states. As a result of that, the Pacific Northwest was always sort of the bellwether for secularism in the United States. If you wanted to know what it was like to live in a place that was not majority Christian, or at least not majority practicing Christian, it was always to look to the Pacific Northwest. Yet even then, culturally, there were still values that were put into people. So while we as followers of Jesus may have certain beliefs that our friends and neighbors didn't share, we still shared the same cultural values because they were inculcated by the major sources of culture, largely entertainment, sports, and the academy. And as a result of those things, we tended to have shared values. So for instance, if I were to tell you that humility is something we should value in our leaders, you would all say, well, of course that's true. And I bet that your friends who are not followers of Jesus, who are around your age, would agree with that. That should be true, right? Our leaders ought to be humble. Actually, we all ought to be humble, but our leaders should exemplify humbleness in what they do. Well, humility is not a worldly value. It just isn't. In fact, the Greco-Roman culture, the idea that you would be humble meant that you were weak, and to be weak was to be despised. The only reason you would be humble was because you didn't have the strength to declare your greatness. And so as a result of that cultural idea permeated most everywhere. But within my lifetime, and I'm 43, within my lifetime, that cultural hegemony of Christianity was broken. It began to fall apart in the late 1960s, but it really isn't until you get to the mid 80s and into the early 90s that hegemony really begins to fall at a pretty rapid pace. And what happens with that is that no longer can we in the West, and specifically the United States, claim to be playing from the same cultural playbook, whether we're Christian or not. And so that Christian values are beginning to become foreign to the culture. There is a new set of ethical and moral values that are rising to the forefront, and they're beginning to not just chisel away, but dynamite the foundation of Western civilization. It's pretty frightening. And the younger you are, the more problematic this is. And so I'm a tail end Gen Xer, which means I'm cynical about everything. But as a result of that, I see, I will have problems in my life for being a Christian and certainly have experienced some of those. Not persecution, don't misunderstand what I'm saying, but I know that my children will definitely be ostracized from many activities, and already have had some of that happen to them as young people in the world today, because they believe that Jesus Christ rose from the dead, and that puts certain values on them, and it means that certain things that the culture celebrates, and again, those major institutions of culture, the certain things that the culture celebrates, they despise, and certain things that the culture despises, they celebrate. And that's the source of the tension that Peter is getting at in our passage tonight. So let's give our attention over to our Bible passage this evening. We're in chapter 4. We'll begin in verse 12. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer, or a thief, or an evildoer, or even as a meddler. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. For it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will be the outcome of those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if the righteous is scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? Therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good. So our passage begins right away with a kindly address, right? So the vocative, beloved, right? The beloved ones. This idea has to permeate everything that Peter is about to say, because he's about to give the church some hard news to take. But he needs to remind you that you are loved, right? Beloved by who? Beloved by the apostle? To be sure, to be loved by the apostle. We love all of the saints. That's part of the call of the Christian. But more importantly, you are beloved of God. And so while we look upon suffering and what he will call the fiery trial here, we look upon suffering, persecution, hatred because of our faith. And we may say, well, God sure has a funny way of showing us that he loves us. Peter says, no, you need to take this in as an a priori assumption. This is true. You just have to stand on it. God loves you. And if you begin to doubt that God loves you, then everything that follows is going to get that much harder, that much harder. And so the proof of God's amazing love for us is this, that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us, right? So if you begin to wonder, well, does God really love me? The reminder to you is Christ died to save you from your sins. You are beloved, and the cross is the proof of God's love. Okay, so after he has addressed you and reminded you of this central truth that you are loved by God, he tells you, do not be surprised at the fiery trial. Now, this harkens us back to an earlier passage in chapter 1, where he says here in verse 7 of chapter 1, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. So when Peter is referring to the fiery trial over here, he certainly is not referring to the fires of hell. He's not referring to difficulties you may have in your life, right? He's not referring to just the challenges that come with living in a fallen, broken world. No, he's referring to something in particular. And the something in particular are those situations into which God places us that refine us, right? And this idea of being refined in the fire has a long pedigree in the Old Testament. We can find it in several places, but we're going to look at just a few of these that kind of touch along this same idea. The first of these is to be found, that's Ezekiel, I grabbed the wrong one, in Zechariah chapter 13, beginning verse 7. He says, awake, O sword, against my shepherd, against the man who stands next to me, declares the Lord of hosts. Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. I will turn my hand against the little ones, and the whole land, declares the Lord. 2/3 shall be cut off and perish, and 1/3 shall be left alive. And I will put this third into the fire and refine them as one refines silver and test them as gold is tested. They will call upon my name and I will answer them. I will say, they are my people, and they will say, the Lord is my God. Now that last little bit is the covenant. Right? So anytime you have this, I will be your God, you will be my people, and the people say, you are our God, we will be your people. This is a rehearsal of the covenant. A rehearsal of the covenant. But God says he's going to put his own people through persecution. And the reason that he's going to do that is largely because of their apostasy, because they have denied and walked away from the Lord. And he says, but those who remain, they're going to be passed through the fire and they're going to be refined on the other side. There is something about suffering for the faith that tends to get rid of the dross, that tends to get rid of the impurities that we have, each one of us individually, and that we have as a community of faith. So what we find here is that this refinement of the gold, Peter is taking from Zechariah, for instance, here, which is the example we're going to use, and he's applying it broadly to the church. He's saying that if this kind of fiery trial, this suffering for the faith comes upon you, we need to, first of all, let me flip back over there. We need to, first of all, not be surprised. This isn't a strange thing like, oh my goodness, how could this happen? And this is the problem with the comfort that we have in the modern age. I'm not complaining, mind you. I'm sitting in a nice warm home in December. No complaining here. But we have so distanced ourselves from death and dying and suffering and pain and illness and sickness that when it confronts us, we view it as foreign and alien to the human experience rather than normal. And so we're in the midst of, a major uptick in COVID-19 cases in the West. And it's been almost 100 years since we've seen really anything like this. And the result of that is we've kind of become unaccustomed to these kinds of things. The advent of antibiotics, for instance, even though we overuse them, that's a whole other story. But the advent of antibiotics meant that there were a lot of things that used to kill us that didn't anymore. Right? The explosion in the number of effective vaccines for dangerous to chicken pox, whatever you want to make it, chicken pox, but which can give you shingles later, so that's a problem. But this idea that you can get these dangerous diseases under control, right, largely grew within the 20th century, so that we've taken all of this stuff and we put it far away from us. Like, it doesn't happen anymore. That's not a problem. We don't worry about that. Now, yes, the flu has always been a problem and continues to be a problem, and an effective vaccine for the flu has been hard to come by. But when this new virus emerges onto the scene and we don't know what to do with it, we really don't. And we don't even understand it at first, right? Harken all the way back to, February, March of this year. We didn't know what it was. We didn't know how deadly it was. We didn't know how contagious it was. We didn't know any of these things. And frankly, we still don't know a lot of things about it. Our knowledge is expanding every day. And unfortunately, the way that human beings work is we tend to project our present self into the past. In pastoral counseling, I have to do this a lot with people. I had somebody I counseled for quite some time. Without going into detail, one of the big challenges was, as a 30-something adult, this person continued to have memories and to project that 30-something adult into that child. And so a child of 10 years old in the memory should be able to make and think like an adult. And one of the things I do in pastoral counseling quite a bit in light of, say, 1 Corinthians 13, when you're a child, you think like a child, is I have to remind people of that. So think of a 10-year-old that you know. right? And put them in the same moral quandary in which you found yourself. Do you think that 10-year-old would make a good decision? Or do you think that 10-year-old would at least be as likely to have made the decision that you made? 12, 13, whatever the age may be. And that's the challenge that we have is people tend to take their present self and project it into the past. So even if you took yourself today, December 2020, and projected yourself back into February of 2020, you have a certain knowledge base regarding the novel coronavirus, SARS-2, that you didn't have then. In fact, nobody did, right? This is a big problem is we assume that people should have known things that they just didn't know. They just don't know. Well, take this back to the text where we find ourselves today. We think that when these fiery trials are going to come upon us, that we have the wherewithal to get through them, and we know what the result is going to be. And Peter is trying to say, well, we do know what the result is going to be, but you may not be ready for them. And in fact, when they come upon you, you're going to say, why is this happening to me? Because suffering isn't a thing that we do anymore. We put it far away from us. And one of the things that coronavirus did for the American culture is it reminded the American culture that you're going to die. And that's why people have really had a problem. Because for the first time in a lot of people's lives, and I'm talking young people too, they have to stare down the barrel of death and realize that they're not immune to it. As Christians, this should be old hat to you. This is like, well, of course you're not immune to death. We're all going to die should the Lord tarry. That's normal. The difference for the Christian is we're not scared of it. We don't have to like the dying part. Jesus didn't like the dying part, but we're not scared of death because we know what happens. And what happens is on the last day, we are raised with Christ to new life. So when the fiery trial comes upon you, you have a double problem. One, you don't know that you're ready. You don't. And two, you can't project either your past self forward or your present self backwards and think that that is somehow going to get you through it. The only way to go through it is to remember what he says at first. And again, it's one of those words that, it's just evocative. It's just the way we start. It's an address. Beloved, right? It's like, okay, well, let's get past that. He says something nice and flowery about the saints, calls them beloved, these elect exiles of the dispersion. And then we blow past that because we want to get to the important part. No, the way you're going to come through the fiery trial, the way you're going to be refined in the fire is by remembering that you're beloved of God. Because if you begin to doubt that for a moment in the midst of persecution, you will fail and you will fall. That doesn't mean you're beyond redemption. Don't mistake what I'm saying. But the persecution will overwhelm you. It is the hardest thing in the world to do. It's the easiest thing to say, and the hardest thing in the world to do is in the midst of suffering to remember that God loves you. It's easy when times are good. Karen Job says this in her commentary. When times are good, it is very easy to say, yes, I'm beloved of God. Right? All of the, I make fun of Christian radio quite a bit, but all of the, kind of Jesus is my boyfriend songs on contemporary Christian radio, they're all about, when they're songs for when times are good. You have to dive into the deep theology of hymnody to find those songs for when times are bad. Christianity is really meant to be lived in a minor key. Right? Building to something beautiful. That's what Peter's getting at. So don't overestimate your ability to be prepared, but also don't assume that you don't have to go through suffering to learn the lessons that suffering can teach. And sort of a third and related point is, if anything, these days should remind you that suffering is common to the human condition. That we have so little suffering in our lives, relatively speaking, is a testament to God's grace. I remember speaking with a missionary some years back, and she had just returned from meeting with Christians down in a country in South America where as Protestants, they were under persecution. And I said, what do they pray when they're in that place? And she says, they pray and thank God for his grace. And then she added something else. She said, but they also pray for us up here. Did you know that? I said, no. What do they pray for us? That we would suffer persecution. I think, well, thanks a lot, right? But the reason that they prayed that is because what persecution does is it has a way of separating the gold from the dross. It's a refiner's fire. So that's what Peter's getting at. He's not talking about the fires of hell. He's talking about the refining fire of suffering, and specifically persecution. Okay, so verse 13, he says, but rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. Right? So in the midst of suffering, it's not enough to just grit your teeth and bear down and get through it. Now, Peter says there's actually something more than that. We are to rejoice that we get to share in Christ's sufferings. Rejoice. Could you imagine rejoicing in the midst of persecution? But we rejoice. We rejoice. We sing. We are glad and happy that we get to share in the sufferings of Christ. The accounts of martyrs, both recent and distant, typically say that Christians rejoice at their martyrdoms. Now, I hope no one here is ever martyred for the faith. Of course not. But this idea that if we suffer for no other reason than because we are Christians, and remember, if you are being obnoxious and you're suffering because you're being obnoxious, that's not the same thing. We'll get to that in a minute. But because you are a follower of Jesus and identified as such, and that's the cause of your suffering, then we need to count that as joy and to return praise to God that we get to join in the sufferings of Christ. We get to share in his sufferings because that's how Christ suffered. Christ did not suffer for doing what was wrong, but for being what is good and right and holy. And if we rejoice in the midst of that persecution, we can also rejoice and be glad on the day that Christ's glory is revealed. So in the present moment, suffering is the name of the game. But in the end, or as Presbyterians like to say, eventually glory. And in glory, the rejoicing is that we have passed through the trial. We have passed through the trial, and we have come out purified on the other side. If you are insulted, right? So now let's take it down from the height of persecution, martyrdom, to probably what will happen much more common. Just happened to be on Twitter today. Somebody called me a bad person because I'm a Christian. It's a long story. But somebody had posted something about pastors, and religious leaders should never shame their congregation or point out their sin. And I'm like, that's kind of like in my job description. And I got told I was a bad pastor, a bad person, and a bad Christian because I would dare to tell people that they're sinners. I said, well, I've kind of made a habit of telling my congregations they're a bunch of dirty, rotten sinners like me. So I guess that makes me a bad person. So there you go. So if you're insulted for the name of Christ, right? So let's be clear. You wear the name of Christ, right? Christian down here in verse 16 means a mini Christ, or one who wears the name of Christ, right? So you wear the name of Christ. You are identified with Jesus. Right? And so you're going to be insulted for no other reason than you're a follower of Jesus. He says, then you are blessed. Now that doesn't feel like blessing, right? Because remember, in a shame honor culture, if somebody insults you, you should have the power to put them in their place, either with a witty repartee, right? You can give them back a sick burn, as the kids like to say today, or with force of arms if you don't have the words to respond. But Peter says, no, we need to stop trying to get up and over the other person, right? Trying to establish our power and dominance over them. Instead, when we are insulted for the name of Christ because we wear Christ, we are blessed. That's a blessing. Jesus' Beatitudes in Matthew 5, for instance, turned the world upside down from a Greco-Roman perspective. He says people are blessed who the most people at the time would say, are you sure you're talking about the right people? The meek? Are we talking about the right people, the poor in spirit? Those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake? Surely those aren't the blessed people, are they, Jesus? The rich, the powerful, the beautiful, those are the blessed people. We could see it. We can look at them. They're blessed. Look at those people. Jesus says that has nothing to do with anything, right? The rain, right, falls on the righteous and the unrighteous. The sun shines on the just and the unjust, right? Your personal position in the hierarchy of humanity in the world is of little consequence to heaven. It's of little consequence to heaven. Because in the end, there's only one thing and one thing only that matters. And I'll go to my favorite popular theologian, Brennan Manning, on this. Brennan Manning said that he was convinced that in the end, you'd be asked, in your final judgment, you'd be asked one and only one question. Did you believe, Jesus will ask you, did you believe that I loved you? Did you trust that I loved you? And in the end, that's it. The dividing line of human history is between faith in Jesus and rejection of faith in Jesus. That's it. You will be on one side or the other based solely on that one criteria. And so if you are insulted for Christ, it means that people see enough of Jesus on you and in you and through you and with you that they will treat you poorly. You're blessed. You're blessed to know that your Christian identity is strong enough that people are threatened by it. It goes on, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you, right? Let's just get the whole Trinity going here, shall we? In the name of Christ, the Spirit of glory, God, here referring to the Father, rests upon you. This is, people see enough of Jesus in you that they are threatened by you. Because what does the Christian bring with him? Well, if you read my devotion earlier today, I quote it from Paul in 2 Corinthians 2. And it's this idea of the fragrance of Christ, right? To those who are being saved, it's the aroma of life. You can't get to it fast enough. But to those who are perishing, it's the sin of death, and you can't get away fast enough. And Paul picks that very, very clearly, the scent of death, because it's disgusting, it's rot, it's decay, right? And disgust is a strong emotion, right? It's one we don't understand, right? It's not that the world hates you, although it may hate you. It's that they're disgusted by you, right? When you hate someone, you want them to go away and never be seen again. When you're disgusted by someone, you want to destroy them, right? If you saw a cockroach running across your floor right now, well, probably you'd be shocked, right? But let's say you did. Your reaction to the cockroach would not be hatred. Oh, I hate you. Oh, I just go so mad. Your reaction would be gross. Smash it with a hammer. And then call the exterminator because you've got bigger problems, right? That's the way the world feels about you. Yes, they hate you, but it's worse than that. They're disgusted by you, because when they get around you, they have to confront the reality of death. And as a Christian, you have already passed through the fear, if not the experience of death. You're not afraid of death anymore. You don't seek it, you don't court it, you don't want it, but you're not afraid of it. And because you're not afraid, two things are true about you. One, you can't be controlled by fear of death. You can't be threatened into compliance. That makes you dangerous, by the way. Because people, the keepers of the way things are, find people who are not afraid and cannot be cajoled by fear threatening. And history is replete with examples of this. And two, one, you're not threatened by death, and so you can't be controlled. And the other major thing that happens when you pass through the fear of death is that you find joy in all circumstances. That's how you can rejoice in the midst of persecution and suffering. So you can't be controlled, and you're joyful. And that's threatening to the world because there's something wrong with you, because you're not like the rest of us. You stand out. Peter's point is, if that happens to you, rejoice. Because you have enough in you that is Christ-like that you are now threatened the world. The world's threatened by you. They don't like you. You act funny. You're too joyful in the midst of this. And you're not afraid. You ought to be afraid. But, Peter says in verse 15, let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or even as a meddler. Karen Jobes points out that meddler is set off in its own grammatical category here, and it's true in the Greek it is. So that's why I added the word even there, even though you don't find it in the ESV text in front of you. So Peter, first of all, says, look, no one here should suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer, right? That would be universal. Right? If there are a couple of universal rules for humanity that we can all sort of agree on cross-culturally, one is don't be a murderer. Now, different cultures will define murder differently over time. Like, for instance, if I were to tell you that within your country's history, dueling, that is asking somebody to go outside and either take up swords or pistols, was not considered murder if you killed your opponent, you might find that a little alarming, but that's true. So the definition of murder can shift over time, but murder is at least we can define as the willfully taking of somebody else's life. The willful taking of someone else's life. And so Peter's very clear, murder for the Christian just doesn't work. That doesn't mean that there aren't instances in which the Christian can be the someone who brings about the end of another's life. There are instances for that. For instance, Jesus blesses men who are serving in the military. And so the military in war is not considered an act of murder. So there's a separate category there. I just want you to keep that in mind. But many, many, many things that we even can find culturally acceptable today would qualify as murder from a biblical perspective. Murder's a problem. Peter says, but that should be obvious. If you're a follower of Jesus, you should be like, yeah, of course, we shouldn't murder. But so would most of the pagans at the time. Okay, and the other kind of universal thing for humanity, ethically speaking, is theft. Right? Theft. And that's taking something that doesn't belong to you. Taking something that doesn't belong to you, right? I teach my kids, there's basically two ethical rules for living your life. Right? And this is how we treat other people. One is don't hurt other people. And two is don't take their stuff. Right? And so then Peter sort of gives an overarching category then of evil doing, and that would be a little more nebulous to define of exactly what we would consider evil and good. But if you think to yourself, right, that's a really nasty, terrible, cruel, vicious, malicious thing to do to somebody, that's probably evil. and you shouldn't do it. Right? Google, for the longest time, had a slogan, as you may know. Yeah, it was "Don't be evil," and then they changed it, which frightened you a little bit. But it's this idea of don't do what's evil. Now, those three are lumped together grammatically in the text. They belong together in a category. And so what Peter is basically saying is, look, here's some universal human ethical ideas. And certainly as a Christian, you shouldn't fall into anything that even the pagans would consider wrong, sinful, bad. Don't do those things. And then he says, or even as a meddler. Right? And so what's a meddler? Oh, you know meddlers. You know meddlers, right? Meddlers are the kind of people who just can't seem to keep out of other people's business. They just can't seem to stay out of other people's business, right? And just stir the pot a little bit, right? And just say a little something here. You know, it's like, boy, husband's spending some long hours at the office. You don't think that he might be stepping out on you, do you? That's a meddler. Right. And so all of a sudden you've got this idea in your head, oh my goodness, I hadn't thought about that. Is that something that's going on? And now you end up in my office for marital counseling. You go, I don't know what's going on here. It's like, probably nothing's going on. Believe me, when affairs are going on, the signs are much different than spending long hours at the office. It's more money's disappearing and I don't know where it's going. That's a good sign that something wrong is happening. So the first three, everyone's on board with. And then and you go, well, of course I'm not a murderer. Of course I'm not a thief. Of course I'm not consciously trying to do what's evil. And like most of these things, it's sort of like 10 Commandments work this way too, right? You get to the end of the 10 Commandments, it's like, well, of course I'm not going to murder anybody, and I'm not going to commit adultery, and I'm not going to commit perjury, and and then you get to the end, it's like, and don't covet. You're like, whoa, 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 hey, whoa. It's like, that's how these lists tend to work in scriptures. You get these big things, and everybody's like, well, of course I wouldn't do that. Of course I wouldn't do that. Of course I wouldn't do that. And don't be a meddler. Well, I'll try not to. But that's what he's saying. Right? He's saying, look, if you're going to suffer, you should suffer because people smell Jesus on you. Not because you're doing these horrible things. Whether they're big ethical violations or little ethical violations, you shouldn't suffer for doing those things, right? Like I said earlier, right? If you're going to suffer because you belong to Jesus and people sense enough of Jesus on you to be disgusted by you. Don't suffer because you're obnoxious or meddler or gossiper. Those aren't good reasons to suffer. Just don't do them. Yet, Peter says in verse 16, if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed. Let him glorify God in that name. So if you should suffer as one who is identified with Christ, that's what the word Christian means here, a little Christ, that is not a source of shame. Now, in an honor-shame culture like the Greco-Roman culture, which Hellenized Judaism was more a part of than what we might call Palestinian Judaism at the time, if you were suffering as a Christian, that's not a source of shame. Now, in Greco-Roman culture, if someone insults you or injures you and you can't respond, it's because you're weak. And if you're weak, you should be ashamed of yourself. In other words, you get pushed down the hierarchy of society and you belong at the bottom. And people at the bottom don't live very long. And you ought to be ashamed of yourself. And what Peter is saying is this actually isn't a source of shame, because what this does is it may it may bring you down in the eyes of the world, but it elevates you in the eyes of God. And so as a result of that, this becomes a source of your glorifying God. You glorify God that you were counted worthy to join in the suffering of Christ. Worthy that you are being elevated in the ranks of heaven, so to speak. It's Peter's point. Okay. Now we get to the more controversial bit tonight. For it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God, and it begins with us. What will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? So, Peter says something that most Protestant Christians don't like. He says, look, you're going to be judged. You're going to be judged. Now, it's true in the New Testament, there are two different words that get used for judgment. There's krina and katakarino. Krina in the verb form would be krino. Krino means to judge, which would be to assess whether something is right or wrong, good or evil, sin or righteousness, right? You assess things. And assessing things in that sense is normal behavior for human beings in general, and it's normal and good behavior for Christians. Right? You should constantly be judging whether or not what you are doing is right or wrong. If you're called to be an elder of the church, one of your jobs is to help people who are struggling in that area to make a proper assessment. That's what church discipline is. Right? So they have either by their weak conscience or there's a number of other features, but somehow sin has crept in and the person is no longer making a proper assessment of what is sin and what is not sin. Right? And so the place of the elder, teaching or ruling or otherwise, the place of the elder in the life of the church is to sort of be the antibodies of the church. Is to say, okay, I think you're not assessing properly that this is sinful. And if that means the application of discipline, and discipline in the sense that we're bringing you to a place of repentance and restoration, that's the goal of church discipline. That's what we will do. We'll apply church discipline in that case. So the other form of this word is katakarino, which just adds a prefix to it. And katakarino means to condemn or to sentence. And this is after the assessment is made, then based upon that assessment, you pronounce a sentence. Right. So, for instance, and this is how criminal trials work in the U.S. too. Right. There are two different phases to the trial. There's establishing whether or not one is guilty, assessment. And then we move on to the sentencing phase, where based upon the assessment that has just been made, that has determined guilt, this is the appropriate punishment. What Christians are oftentimes, where Christians get this wrong, is we don't understand that there's a difference between those two things. We just don't. And so we turn to something like Jesus in Matthew 7, right, where he says, judge not lest ye be judged. With the measure you measure out, it will be measured to you, right? What Jesus is getting at there is not assessment, normal. What he's getting at there is, look, if you're going around and you're telling everybody else what's wrong with them, and you are condemning them in doing so, don't be surprised when the same condemnation comes to you. Don't be surprised, right? Francis Schaeffer, famous Presbyterian pastor, so famous I have to tell you he's famous, but he is. Francis Schaeffer talks about this in the sense of final judgment, where he says, imagine at your final judgment, you have had this will date Francis Schaeffer for you, you've had a tape recorder, an invisible tape recorder around your neck. And all that tape recorder has ever done is it's just recorded every thought, every feeling, every word you've ever had, which contains the word ought. This is the way people ought to act. This is the way people ought to think. This is the way people ought to speak. And that's all it's done. And all that happens at your final judgment is Jesus takes off the silent tape recorder, the invisible tape recorder. He puts it down in the middle of the room. He presses play and then shows you a slideshow of your life where you violated every single one of your own principles. Because that's what happens, right? That's normal. And so that's moving out of assessment and moving into sentencing, right? And so that's the thing that Jesus tells us we can't do. But unfortunately, because we also confuse these two ideas, it gives this false idea that Christians will in no way experience judgment, right? So basically, what happens on the last day at the white throne of judgment is, you just go off and sit in the corner and, I don't know, sip a mimosa while Jesus judges the rest of the world and go get him, Jesus, we're on your team, go on. We'll be over here. No, that's not the pictures of the white throne of judgment. White throne judgment, there's a separating of the ways, what C.S. Lewis called the Great Divorce. There is a separation of the sheep and the goats from, say, Matthew 25, but the sheep and the goats are put through a phase of judgment. You are told you belong here or you belong there, right? And what does that entail is somewhat murky in the scripture, but you have to expect that as a Christian. In fact, if we give our attention over to Romans, that's Ezekiel. Where's Romans? I didn't open up the Romans passage. That's why. We'll go over to Romans 14. Nope, I went a little too far. Starting in verse 5. One person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. So what Paul's talking about with the Romans, he's saying, right, should you celebrate the Sabbath or not celebrate the Sabbath? Do what you think is right there. There's no hard rule about this. It says the one who observes the day observes it in honor of the Lord. The one who eats in honor of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God, while the one who abstains in honor of the Lord and gives thanks to God. In other words, whatever you do it for God, and it's okay. Right. One way to think ethically as a Christian is if you're thinking of doing something, right, and you can't say, I do this in the name of Jesus aloud with a straight face, it's probably not the right thing to do. Okay. Verse 7. For none of us lives to himself and none of us dies to himself. For if we live to the Lord. And if we die to the Lord. So then whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. For to this end Christ died and lived again, that he might be Lord both of the dead and the living. So you belong to Jesus, and Jesus is Lord of both the living and the dead. So there's nowhere you can go in human existence apart from his lordship. Verse 10, and this is the important one for us. Why do you pass judgment on your brother? Sentencing. Or you, why do you despise your brother? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God. For it is written, as I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow to me and every tongue shall confess to God. So then each of us will give an account of himself to God. Now, there are lots of people out there who will do all sorts of exegetical gymnastics to get around the plain meaning of the text here. And the plain meaning of the text, right, is that your life will be assessed by Jesus. You will give an account to God. But you are delivered from condemnation. Right? So in the end, after the assessment is made, and you are asked, okay, that's the assessment. What do you have to say for yourself? And the answer is Jesus. That's what I have to say for myself. My beloved Savior died to save me and deliver me unto God. So that's what Peter's getting at over here. It's the same idea. Right? He's saying, okay, judgment is going to begin in the household of God. And again, we looked at this. I grabbed this earlier. This is Ezekiel chapter 9. We'll start in verse 3. We're really looking at verses 5 and 6, but verse 3 is important. We'll read down through there. So Ezekiel prophesied, now the glory of God of Israel had gone up from the cherub on which it rested to the threshold of the house. And he called to the man clothed in linen who had written who had the writing case at his waist. And the Lord said to him, pass through the city, through Jerusalem, and put a mark on the foreheads of the men who sigh and groan over all the abominations that are committed in it. And to the others, he said in my hearing, pass through the city after him and strike. Your eye shall not spare, and you shall show no pity. Kill old men outright, young men, maidens, children, little children, women, but touch no one on whom is the mark. And begin at my sanctuary. So they began with the elders who were before the house. If you're an elder, be a little nervous here. The idea here is there is an assessment. Do you belong to Jesus or not? In this case, do you belong to Yahweh? And do you abhor the abominations, the idolatry and injustice that are being perpetrated in God's holy city, Jerusalem, at the time? And there will be a great sorting of the ways. In this case, brought about by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon when he comes and destroys Jerusalem. People will be sorted out. And God is saying that that is actually his hand at work in the city of Jerusalem, sorting the wheat from the chaff, the sheep from the goats. That's what's going on there. Right? So while as Christians, we like to put judgment far away from us, right? This idea doesn't square with the rest of the Bible. It just doesn't. Zechariah, which we read earlier, makes a similar point. Malachi, which we'll come to now, verses 3 through 5. Behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me. And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. And the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight, behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. But who can endure the day of his coming? And who can stand when he appears? For he is like a refiner's fire and like fuller's soap. He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver, and he will purify the sons of Levi and refine them like gold and silver, and they will bring offering and righteousness to the Lord. And then the offering to Judah and Jerusalem will be pleasing to the Lord as in the days of old, as in former years, right? What's the problem for Malachi? The priests have perverted the worship of Yahweh, and they've done so by being lax in their standards. Right? That's Malachi's big problem. What Malachi is saying is that his messenger is going to come, right? God's messenger is going to come, and there's going to be a refining. And this will purify the people. The assessment is going to be made, and that which is not worthy will be discarded. 5. Then I will draw near to you for judgment. I will be a swift witness against the sorcerers, against the adulterers, against those who swear falsely, against those who oppress the hired worker in his wages, the widow and the fatherless, against those who thrust aside the sojourner and do not fear me, says the Lord of hosts. Right? So the one who, those who are particularly at danger here are those sorcerers, right? We think, oh, there's no such thing as magic. Well, these are people who believe that they could manipulate the spiritual world by using physical objects, right? That's sorcery. Adulterers, these are people who run around on their spouse, right? It's kind of a sin we don't care about in Western civilization anymore to a large extent, unless it happens to you personally. It's a big deal. It's a big problem. Swear falsely, right? This isn't just that you're lying. This is that you are taking an oath and lying about it, largely to the detriment of somebody else. Against those who oppress the hired worker and his wages, or the widow and the fatherless, right? These are the most vulnerable people in society. And if you would treat them, right, like they're objects and not people, and you would treat them like they are less than, then God is against you. Against those who thrust aside the sojourner, right? This is somebody who is traveling in your midst, right? This is a resident alien, so to speak, right? And you're going to treat them as if they're less than. Again, God is against you, right? And so like most of these lists, right, you get through it and well, of course I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do that and wouldn't do that and wouldn't do that. And then you get to the end, and do not fear me. Oh. Well, that's something. Because do I always fear the Lord, right? Which is that awesome respect that God is righteous and holy and that I am not. And that God's proper and just response to me ought to be my utter destruction. Do I treat God like he is like that and like that's what I deserve? No, not most of the time. Most of the time we think of God as a cosmic piggy bank, right? Or a cosmic gumball machine, right? You put in the prayer, you twist the dial, and he gives you what you want. Well, that doesn't work from a scriptural standpoint. And so we as Christians need to be constantly reminded that God is to be loved, but he is also to be feared. And we need to keep those two ideas in tension. So back to 1 Peter, right? For it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God, right? Good Old Testament precedent. Judgment begins in the household of God. It doesn't start there, but it does begin there. And if it begins with us, in other words, we will go through this assessment, it will also go out into the world. And if we who have the hope of salvation, not cross your fingers hope, but surety of salvation in Jesus Christ, if we go through this assessment and we know it's coming and it's already starting with us, and that's part of this persecution, part of this fiery trial is that refining fire of judgment, that refining assessment, right? Because if there's one thing that happens when you're suffering, is you begin to realize what's really important to you. You begin to realize what's really important to you. I know we have some firefighters here, but it's that question, right? If your house is on fire, what do you grab on the way out the door? What's really important to you, right? Hopefully, in my case, it'd be my kids, right? That's what's important to me. But, especially my oldest daughter, Marion, if I said, well, you have to grab what's most important to you out the door, she'd say, well, how am I going to get all the pets that quick? That's just the way it is. It's like, well, how about your sister? Well, they'll probably be fine. But that's our future veterinarian, most likely. So there you are. That being said, that's what comes down to is we have to understand that we have passed through this and this has focused our priorities. Right? We know what's important. That's what suffering does in the life of the Christian, is it focuses your priority and tells you what's really important. So if we go through those periods of assessment, even now in this time and in this age, and we'll have a final assessment, what about the world that doesn't believe? What's going to happen to them? What's going to be their lot in the final judgment? Well, their lot, they pass through the assessment into condemnation. It says, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? Those who do not trust in Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, to use those good old evangelical terms? Condemnation, eternal condemnation, hell. That's the outcome. And as Christians, we have to remember that. Like that all of those, of our secular and friends of other religions, that what we actually believe and what Scripture really teaches is Jesus is the dividing line. You are either in Jesus or you're not. You're either in Jesus or you're not. So he quotes from the Proverbs here, from the Septuagint version. We'll take a look at the Hebrew translation in just a moment. But he says, if the righteous is scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? Right? And we think, well, scarcely saved. I mean, don't we have such a firm foundation, right? Don't we have this amazing grace? Don't we have all of these things? No, the question is, are you worthy of the salvation that you have? And the answer is no, I'm not. And so your salvation is not by your own works, not by your own merits, not by your own efforts. It's by Christ. And that's the way you pass through, is Christ. What about those who don't have Christ? Okay, so let's take a look at the Proverbs section here. And we're in chapter 11, verse 31. And this is what Solomon says here in chapter 11. At the rate I'm going through Proverbs devotions in our weekly emails, I'll be to this, I think, somewhere in 2025. So if the righteous is repaid on earth, how much more the wicked and the sinner? Right? And so what Solomon is saying is that there is a temporal as well as eternal judgment. Right? And so if we see righteousness on the earth, and there is a repayment for that righteousness, in other words, if you do what is good and right and holy in the world, then there is a blessing from God, not material. Don't ever confuse those ideas. Not a material blessing. It's not, well, I'm good and right and holy in the world, and so now, everybody loves me and I have a really high salary, and, we're all from Lake Wobegon then, right? Where all the women are strong, all the men are good looking, and all the children are above average, right? No, that's not what's going on here. No, this is a blessing from God, right? So how is righteousness repaid in the earth? By knowing you belong to God, by knowing you're beloved. But there is also a price for wickedness and sin. And we see it, right? You know this. I don't have to go into detail. You know there's a price for wickedness and sin. You know it because you've seen the consequences of wickedness and sin in your own life, either perpetrated against you or caused by your own wickedness and sin. You've seen the cost of this. So there's a temporal element to this, but there's also, and Solomon's touching on both of these, there's also an eternal element to this. And that's what Peter is picking up here. And he's bringing in both of those ideas. There's something that happens here and now, but there's also something that happens then and there. And both of those things are happening at once, or what a lot of theologians will call the already and the not yet of eschatology. That these things are already taking place, but they have not yet taken place. In other words, we're getting sneak previews, foreshadowing of that which is to come. And so the assessment through suffering that we're going through right now, that is refining us right now, is telling us of a greater refining that will come at the end. And so those things are to be kept in tension in the life of the Christian. And that's how we view suffering, specifically suffering because we're Christian. That this is refining me. It is stripping away that which is not of Christ, and it is leaving behind that which is pure. So he concludes, and you might call this the ethical point of this entire section of Peter, 1 Peter. Therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good. So if you're going to suffer, right, let it be suffering because you're doing the will of God. And if that's the case, then you can entrust your soul to your faithful Creator while you do what is good. In other words, suffer for doing the good thing, not for doing the evil thing. Because if you suffer for doing the good thing, you belong to God. You belong to God. And you can rest in that surety that you are beloved, you are blessed, and you can rejoice even in the midst of suffering. Again, have we experienced this kind of suffering in our lifetimes? Maybe occasionally, not to the extent that many of our brothers and sisters in the world do as we speak. But is it on the rise? I think the answer is yes. And I say that with some trepidation. And the reason that I think that the answer is yes is because what we would have assumed everyone agrees with, right? Love, compassion for all, humility, trust, honesty. Right? That these are, we've been so steeped in Christendom. We've been so used to this Christian background radiation on the culture, that everyone has these values, that as the culture and people in it are becoming less Christian, we're surprised that they act less Christian. That the shame, honor culture stuff that we thought we extinguished is making a comeback. Right? There was prior to sort of the rise of critical race theorists and some other major challenges the church is facing right now, For the longest time, we thought that the biggest challenge to the church was the Neo-Atheist movement. I mean, the Neo-Atheist movement, kind of basically died of its own weight. It really died of its own weight because the Neo-Atheist movement in the end had to admit that the values that it thought were universal are not universal, and that they were indeed the product of Christendom. And that's kind of where the Neo-Atheist movement is right now, is they're fighting with each other over whether or not that's really true, because they can't face Nietzsche square in the face. Because what Nietzsche says is horrible. What Nietzsche says is that in order for Western civilization to reach its potential, we have to kill God. In other words, we have to kill Christianity and substitute the values of Christianity for those that we will make for ourselves. That's how man moves from being man to being Superman, according to Nietzsche. And everybody gets to that point in Nietzsche and they go, whoa, hey, hold on a minute. Because if I'm in charge of deciding what's good and right, what's holy, what's just, how everyone else needs to act, I'm a little nervous. Or worse, we're not nervous. And we're going to do a bad job of it. And what I want you to understand is this is precisely the moment in which Peter found himself then. And we think that we're going to move forward into this great secular age where, it's all pie in the sky, rainbows, you get to eat dessert for every meal. It's a wonderful time. But all it is just a return to shame, honor, culture, and paganism. That's all it is. We may change the names. We may be a little more sophisticated, and not worship, idols of stone and iron. But we're just returning to idolatry. We're just worshiping things that are not God. And as a result, we shouldn't expect that Christian values, as we understand them from places like 1 Peter, are going to last very long. And those who hold those values, because you will now be at enmity with the surrounding culture, those who hold those values will be persecuted. You will be treated as doing evil for doing what is good. So what can the Christian do right now? Well, it's back to the proverbial story of Joseph in the book of Genesis. Right? So Joseph does nothing wrong, and his brothers waylay him and sell him into slavery. And while he is a slave in Egypt, he works his way up through the ranks of a powerful Egyptian named Potiphar and becomes sort of his head of household. Right, so he's the chief steward of the house. He's taking care of all of the affairs of Potiphar for him. And in that time, Potiphar's wife takes a fancy to the young Hebrew man and tries to seduce him. And he runs away naked, which makes Potiphar's wife's claim that he tried to rape her seem plausible. And so Joseph is thrown into prison. There, he interprets some dreams, but he gets forgotten about. But it's what happens to him in prison that's really important. Right? So he's suffering. He's at the bottom. And what ends up happening to him while he's in prison is that he works his way up through the ranks, and he basically begins to run the prison from the inside. In other words, these moments of suffering keep coming to Joseph. And in the midst of the suffering, he chooses to do what is good. And as a result, he becomes a blessing to others. That's the call of the Christian. Keep doing what is good. And as a result, you will know that you are beloved of God, and you will be a blessing to others. So we'll close there with a word of prayer tonight. This is purification from the valley of vision. Let us pray. Lord Jesus, I sin. Grant that I may never cease grieving because of it, never be content with myself, never think I can reach a point of perfection. Kill my envy, command my tongue, trample down self. Give me grace to be holy, to be kind, to be gentle, to be pure, to be peaceable, to live for thee and not for self, to copy thy words, thy acts, thy spirit, to be transformed into thy likeness, to be consecrated wholly to thee, to live entirely to thy glory. Deliver me from attachment to things unclean, from wrong associations, from the predominance of evil passions, from the sugar of sin as well as its gall, that with self-loathing, deep contrition, earnest heart searching, I may come to thee, cast myself on thee, trust in thee, cry to thee, be delivered by thee. O God, the eternal all, help me to know that all things are shadows, but thou art substance. All things are quicksands, but thou art mountain. All things are shifting, but thou art anchor. All things are ignorance, but thou art wisdom. If my life is to be a crucible amid burning heat, so be it. But do thou sit at the furnace mouth to watch the ore, that nothing be lost. If I sin willfully, grievously, tormentedly, in grace take away my mourning and give me music. Remove my sackcloth and clothe me with beauty. Still my sighs and fill my mouth with song. Then give me summer weather as a Christian. Amen.